Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. You're listening to our special series focused on peace negotiations, accountability, technology, and the evolving character of war in the 21st century. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Professor Matthew Ford. Matthew, welcome to the program.
Paul, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
For our audience, many of whom know you and have read your book, for those 3 or 4 that haven't, I'll give a brief bio. Matthew is an associate professor at the Swedish Defence University and is one of the leading scholars examining how connectivity and digital technologies are reshaping the conduct of war in the 21st century battlefields. His latest book, War in the Smartphone Age, explores how smartphones have radically democratized participation in warfare, for good and for bad. He uses Ukraine as a powerful illustration of how connectivity is reshaping both battlefield practice and the politics of war's representation. He's also the co-author of Radical War, a landmark study on how digital media collapses the boundaries between battlefield and audience, and the author of Weapon of Choice, an influential analysis of military intervention and institutional adaptation. Now, before entering academia, before joining the ivory tower, Matthew had a real life as a strategic analyst for the UK Ministry of Defense, and he has held visiting appointments at the US Naval Postgraduate School and West Point. He is also the founding editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Military History. Now, in our conversation today, we will turn to one of the most transformative questions in modern conflict: how technology is reshaping warfare from the battlefield to the courtroom. Drones, satellites, smartphones, and artificial intelligence are changing not only how wars are fought, but how they are seen, recorded, and prosecuted. Ukraine's experience since 2014 has become a living laboratory of these shifts, where open source intelligence, digital evidence, and networked warfare are challenging our traditional assumptions about command, control, and accountability. Matthew, it's a real pleasure to have you with us, and I'm so looking forward to drawing on your expertise as we explore the future of warfare in the digital age.
Paul, thank you very much for having me on, and I'm grateful to you for waiting out for me. I know I've been in conversations with you for a few months now, but I've just been very busy. It's a great pleasure to be on now. Thank you.
Matthew, let's help our audience get to know you as a person before we dive into your thoughts on the digitization of modern warfare. Tell us a little bit about how you came about deciding to be a professor. I know you'd worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers and a few other places before transitioning into academia, and then deciding on digital warfare. Was this something you dreamed about as a child, or you stumbled into it along the way somehow?
A bit of stumbling always helps. Yeah, no, I used to work in the City of London with IBM, PricewaterhouseCoopers and then IBM for about 5 years. And I was always interested in the relationship between or how organizations manage change. And so I've actually been more interested in why organizations, how managing change fails rather than how it succeeds, which is, of course, something that management consultants don't really want to talk about because there's no sales in fail. I figured that if you study the way things actually work in terms of whether it's for good or bad, a success or not, then you might get a good appreciation for how organizations manage change. The underlying problem, of course, is that the more you study it academically, the less relevant you are from a management consulting point of view, because in consulting, it's about finding opportunities to make a sale and pitching particular product that will that is about achieving some success, actually trying to understand the context in a deep and, dare I say, anthropological kind of way, which is where I started to focus my research, isn't something that necessarily have any reason to do as much as anything. So I was interested in the relationship between engineers and users. And so the engineers come up with clever, sophisticated devices and go and look for users to sell them to, or the users have problems, so they need to find an engineer to try and solve that problem. And of course, when you start looking at this in academic terms, you find that the relationship is considerably more overlapping and blurred and a lot harder to interpret in the ways that you might if you were trying to make a sales pitch. And that led me to explore how organizations innovate. And in particular, I was interested in the armed forces. I had a number of different technologies I was considering, thinking through, and I approached a supervisor and I said, let's think about the technical change and how that brings into conversation the relationship with the engineer and user. I suggested missiles, no. I suggested tanks, no. And then I foolishly said guns. And so for a 10 years of my academic life, I've been studied guns. But the advantage of studying guns really is that they're very simple technologies, only 120 components in them or thereabouts. So it becomes very easy to trace the arguments about these technologies as they move from the battlefield through to the engineer, to the scientist, to the bureaucrat, to the alliance partner, and to industry. And you can trace the arguments and how they work across these different dimensions. And in the process, you can see how power within the military industrial complex works. And so the step from there to digital technology really was, I find myself interested in mundane technology. And now the smartphone is mundane, and it has been for some considerable time, and we take it for granted. And we don't think about how these technologies are shaping violence, because we luckily, maybe more often than not, we aren't in situations where we're in a war and are connected. But what happens when we are? And how if we go from rifles, a mundane technology, to smartphones, a mundane technology? How have things changed in that century or so? I don't know. It's you don't think of small arms as innovating particularly, and now I don't know how smartphones innovate because they're sophisticated as they stand. But my contention overall is that these technologies have had fundamental effects on how we come to conduct war, and a little bit of attention on that makes a bit of sense. Yeah, so that's where I've come from. And obviously everyone's interested in AI, but I think there's a kind of step before that we probably need to elaborate on a little bit more before we focus on AI as a platform. But that's just me. Maybe we'll get into it as we go.
Matthew, let's unpack that a little bit. I'm from Cupertino, California, the home of Apple computer, the smartphone, and I think of it as a tool for many things, but I have never really thought of the role of the smartphone in modern warfare, both how warfare is conducted and how warfare is perceived. So can you unpack that a little bit and walk us through what you mean by the smartphone blurring the lines between the front lines and the home lines?
Sure. I think the first thing to just say up front is, of course, the level of connectivity around the world. Something like 96% of the world can get a 3G network or something like that. Sometimes we think that connectivity is limited or is not ubiquitous. The places that aren't online are the sorts of places you don't actually want to go to. That's not to say that everyone has equal access to the technologies, and that's an interesting thing in itself, that the distribution of connected technologies, smartphones and whatever, are not evenly distributed. And that shapes a lot of the ways people can conduct and represent war. But the important thing to reflect on is that most of our lives, certainly in the global north, most of our lives are online in some way, shape or form, depending on the particular history of connectivity within a particular country. You can buy everything from a mortgage to do your banking, to buy food, to obviously get a taxi, all sorts of your entire life. Our entire lives are on these things. And so the question I had in my mind, and this sort of dropped out of the work that I was doing with Andrew Hoskins in Radical War as well, is what happens when you move your ordinary connected life meets war. War has come to Ukraine, and Ukraine is a highly connected country. What happens to life in those circumstances? And not only how does it shape how we live, but how does it shape how we fight? Now, Ukraine's very different compared to somewhere like Somalia and the Sahel, which is another bit of work I've been doing with some colleagues from Leiden and from Copenhagen. Where war has been going on in those parts of the world for I don't know, 40, 50 years. And in these circumstances, digitization has come to the war. So you've got a very different set of experiences about how the way we come to know and understand war is reflected in this digital space. And so the suggestion I'd put to you is that our phones become a place where we can conduct war either by amplifying media messages via social media. So I can sit in a tube in London and I can post something about a tweet about or a post about war, and it amplifies it. It shows I'm engaged. It shows how connected it's about shaping my attention. It's also about potentially shaping other people's attention. And of course, people actually fighting wars have their phones on them. And that's, even though clearly places like Ukraine have become much more aware of the implications of what it is to have a connected device in your pocket whilst you're on the front lines, people still do have those devices around. And that is giving people the opportunity, certainly in the early parts of the war in Ukraine, but in other places like Somalia and Sahel, you're using WhatsApp to broadcast and communicate and organize or make it possible to fight. And in Ukraine, you might be using your smartphone to power a drone or something. Certainly at the beginning of the conflict, where things were considerably more, the full-scale invasion, when things were, and even in 2014, where things were a lot more fluid. And of course, soldiers are using their smartphone to chat. What happened to postal services? Does anyone send a letter anymore? You'll send an email or more like a WhatsApp message, but you won't necessarily do that on the front line. You'll get back to somewhere safe, somewhere secure, and then maybe communicate, download a film, play a game, or from the device you have in your hand. So it connects that line to other parts of the world, and it does it on a 24/7 basis. In an online way, just people on the other side of the planet can be reposting something you did earlier today if you were on the front line. It goes through all of the other, this is where it helps to know something about the armed forces, but if it goes through all the various other steps associated with broadcasting that from the front line. So I think that's the nature of contemporary conflict. And it does, it's the same in Ukraine as it is in Somalia and Sahel in that respect.
You mentioned going through the chain of command or through the other dimensions of broadcasting amplification. And this, for me as a lawyer, this raises a little bit of a question about accountability, both in terms of maybe incitement to a crime against humanity and incitement to genocide. We've seen that with the genocide against the Rohingya and the role that Facebook played in amplifying that. And it was Facebook's algorithm plus individuals, both in Myanmar and other places, amplifying that. If you're using smartphones for sharing targeting information, the Geneva Conventions are 75 years old. As lawyers, we like to talk about customary international law and the evolution of international law. Has digital warfare outstripped the existing legal framework for protecting civilians from crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes?
This is clearly a hotly contested topic, and I think people working on the laws of non-conflict will probably break on two sides of the argument. On the one hand, laws of non-conflict can bend and adjust to deal with the complexities caused by digitization. And then on the other side, this is a new technology and the protocols might need to adjust to account for those technologies. I think what seems to me to be very much the case in terms of the practicalities of some of these things is that, when the war is digitally mediated, and that digital mediation is something we need to be attentive to when it comes to thinking about both, certainly in terms of war's conduct and representation, but in addition, how the law works in these spaces. And, what seems to me to be pretty clear is that on the one hand, you've got algorithmic challenges and concerns, but also you're working in a place where those who have control over these platforms are either in your part of the world, in Confina, in somewhere in the US, are subject to US legal framework as much as they might be to an international legal framework. And a lot of this, it seems to me, comes down in part to how the platform itself decides to enforce its own policies, whether even the platform can enforce its own policies, whether the technologies would allow them to do that in different circumstances or situations. And for example, the thing that strikes me as being evidently the case is that somewhere like Ethiopia, there's 106 different languages. Not all of them have been coded. And somewhere like a platform like Facebook might have content moderators in Kenya. I don't know whether they still do under the direction of the recent deals have been made with President Trump, but content moderation in America has been changed, if I understand it correctly. Do those content moderation practices change outside of America too? And so then the question is, do you have any content moderators who can speak any of those or can communicate any of those 106 odd languages? And before we even get to whether any automation can be applied to those posts on social media, is there any money to be made out of coming up with the an algorithm to manage those posts? Because AI, if we start thinking about large language models or AI more broadly, these things are more than able to deal with English. But if we start moving off to languages where there's very little commercial value for an AI platform or even Facebook who might apply some of these technologies, where's the commercial benefit in automating some of that? And I suppose in the background then becomes a set of challenges around how to manage the way political violence ends up on in some of these places. And it's one thing maybe for the laws of armed conflict or a domestic law to apply. It's another thing for the platform to actually do something about it. And that, even if it's a gap of a week or a couple of days between a post going online, it going viral, an activist or someone else spotting it and then putting in a request to have that post pulled down, that's still 2 days of a couple of days of inflammatory posting that has all sorts of political effects that independently of the policy framework might even be there. But despite that, there are more people out there communicating in ways that the platform can manage or has any financial incentive to manage. And so these things quickly can spiral in ways that lead to violence. I think it's one thing, the legal framework is another thing enforcing that. So I think, and that's something, I think the lawyers know this thinking very well.
It's pretty clear all of the things you're not allowed to do, but then actually prosecuting individuals, either deterring and or prosecuting people. You mentioned WhatsApp, you mentioned Facebook. We all know about Starlink. First, it was turned off on the Ukrainians. Now it's turned off on the Russians. It's apparently had quite a significant impact on the dynamics on the battlefield. These are private sector actors. And you've recently written an op-ed in Opinion Juris where you talk about how states relying on these privately owned digital infrastructures has transformed war as a service. What does that mean? And how does this impact sovereignty? Imagine when you were studying guns, it was the UK Ministry of Defence, which owned the guns, but they didn't lease them. But now it's the technologies owned by the private sector, and the military is one of the users. They pay their $20 a month or whatever it is for ChatGPT to conduct their war.
Yeah. So, And of course, you hit the nail on the head, Paul. If you don't pay your subscription, then you lose access to the service. Or more importantly, more likely, it seems to me, if you don't pay your subscription, you can't keep your software up to date. And if you can't keep your software up to date and you can't keep your targeting package, I can imagine you need to, I'm going to put this crudely, but you have your Insurgent Pack 101 downloadable content, and then you don't keep up your subscription as a service like you were buying Microsoft 365 Office. So that your software goes out of date, and then you need an upgrade on the targeting pack that you have for Insurgent Target Pack 2, which allows you to distinguish in more forensic detail a civilian from a combatant. You're relying on the old downloadable content, and you find yourself killing the wrong people. This strikes me as being, in that respect, this notion of software as a service or war as a service, the business model and this is where some of those, my earlier career working in management consulting follows. Buying a platform to buying a service locks you in that relationship with the service provider. And then the emphasis becomes on the contractual relations you have with the service providers to allow you to standardize different technologies, maybe metadata, other standardized data, so that you could plug and play different network service providers. But all of that requires there to be a market in service provisions. And all of that doesn't quite exist quite yet. So we don't have standards around some of these things. And effectively, different service providers could lock themselves into and embed themselves further into the state in a way that then the state, at a core level, in a relation to command and control, in relation to the nervous system of the armed forces, can't easily get out unless it has to keep its subscription going. And so there's a beautiful Black Mirror episode on Netflix. It's quite horrific, but it makes the point really. The initial sale is where you get online and you're a part of the experiment and you're for free. And then the service provision changes so that you can either extend the network for an upgrade and here, this is in relation to someone actually on the Netflix episode, is about someone using some level of connectivity to stay alive. And so you change the subscription model and you may or may not be able to stay alive, right? So, and to a point where the fees go up or you start to have to accept advertising as part of the program. And it's that kind of, what's the phrase? It's the enshittification of the internet, which is absolutely that kind of what you took for granted and suddenly becomes subscription, then it becomes you get locked in and then you can't actually extract yourself. And that clearly, in my mind at least, has a significant meanings for those who want to think about the state having sole legitimate control over their use of military power.
Matthew, you've just described my relationship with Amazon Prime. You pay the flat fee and everything else is free until it's not. And in our household, my wife and I have very few points of contention, but the one we do have is, do we pay the $12 for ad free this month or do we watch the ads? I'm a watch the ads person because that's how I become culturally aware. She's like, seriously, right. It's $12. No, it's the principle of it. But you can see military, the government's getting hooked on this. Pay your fee or we're going to unplug your Starlink or we're going to unplug your targeting. Let's shift gears.
I think it's a genuine, I think it's a genuine problem, Paul. Sorry, Toad. I think it's a big problem. And it's a much bigger problem than governments seem to be acknowledging. And I think it's a problem for democratic accountability. And unless their contracts are very carefully written by government lawyers and not by the service providers, I think we could get ourselves into all sorts of problems.
As a former government lawyer, yes, jobs program for lawyers. We need more lawyers to track. Let me ask you this. So when my law students listen to these podcasts, they're always like, now don't forget, put a plug in for more lawyers. Speaking of more lawyers, one of the things that is at first everyone was excited about was the ability to track atrocity crimes on their smartphones, to upload them onto secure servers out of the country. And for about a year, we were part of this. International Bar Association's Eyewitness program was a part of this. And now the response is, we have trillions of bytes of information. One, how do we sort it all? And two, what's real and what's not real? What's deepfakes? It's a tsunami of information. We miss the good old days of going and sitting down and talking with someone and taking an affidavit. What are your thoughts on that? Where's that headed?
Yeah, I think we're in a very dangerous, it's a hall of mirrors potentially, where on the one hand, people can, the extent to which digital evidence is acceptable in a court is one thing, right? So if the smartphone had blockchain technology and evidence recording so that you could evaluate the provenance of the material that was being to the point where you thought a war crime was going on, I can imagine that would be admissible because there's no way of fiddling around with the data in any way when it gets to court. But most of this stuff, it seems to me, is just people incidentally capturing something on their phone And then it it gets broadcast, but it gets broadcast in a context where lots of other people are trying to shape the information environment. And you can see some of these challenges emerging in relation to the war in Iran. The school that was attacked by a missile of some kind kills 175 people. In the Maven technology, the target patented Maven technology that the US armed forces are now making use of for target generation and situation awareness and organizing the air campaign in Iran, that couple of things occurred. If public reports are to be believed, and I realize that the Department of Defense has yet to talk the general public through the process by which that incident happened. And I, for one, even though I'm not an American citizen, I and still, for one, be very pleased if the US government decided to allow that information to come through, because I think it's crucial for making sense of how contemporary targeting makes sense. And that's important from a rest of the world point of view, should we be deciding to make use of Palantir Maven software. But if I understand it correctly, based on public reports, on the one hand, the school was recorded in a intelligence database somewhere along the lines of being previously a military institution. But more recently, in fact, just 2 days prior to the attack, social media was according to some excellent research by someone who works for the NGO Witness. What they showed, or what they claimed at least, was that an AI-generated image of the school with Iranian military equipment was posted on Instagram 2 days before the attack. So the combination of outdated intelligence data on a database plus social media content, even though it was false, AI-generated social media content, the combination and Pete Hegseth has been talking about targeting circles, I think. It brings a number of different sources of evidence together, and the targeting circles start to overlap. Whatever you might have in terms of military intelligence, plus what you see on social media, plus what you might have from human sources, plus all the other different data, all comes together, closes on identifying a particular target, which then greenlights the target for an attack. That was, of course, let's not rule out the fact that the Iranians themselves are looking to use civilian sites as a shield for, or as a way of masking their military activities, so that they can then use human shields as a way of winning the information war. But when you have a combination of deliberate activity plus the digitally mediated activity from individuals or nefarious actors looking to generate erroneous, inaccurate, or purposefully deceiving imagery, and on top of that, you have failed military data that's not up to date, you create this sort of perfect storm in terms of where's the evidence? What's the evidence base? How does this all map together? How do we trace the lines of responsibility in here? And so, and how do we trace where's the causality? It becomes very difficult to trace. And from a legal point of view, clearly that's problematic. From a legitimacy of war point of view, from just the ordinary citizen trying to make sense of and interpret what's going on, the amount of imagery that then gets put out there that sort of creates more noise to signal is so intense. The implication is, it seems to me, that people actually switch off. We're back to our cat memes. I'm a cat lover. I don't have a problem with cat memes, but the politics of it is such that people switch off, and we get overly emotionally engaged or entangled in this, and it switches attention, and then we bounce from one possible military activity to another, not being able to take in what's happening. And I think, how many war crimes tribunals have we actually seen? So we've got this explosion of data, but we ask, where's the appetite for acting on it? So good folks are collecting, documenting, making it possible to undertake some kind of intervention down the line, but you don't see many people, you don't, none of that's actually pulled through, it seems to me. And I think the social media context in which we're working encourages that, or rather discourages that.
And I think we've seen that with the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Early on, it grabbed the world's attention because you could see it on your smartphone. And then it grabbed the world's attention for accountability, and the evidence, the witness statements, et cetera, victim survivor statements were flowing in. But, oh, look, cat memes, or, oh, look, March Madness. And there's so much information coming in, both about Ukraine that you become a little bit desensitized to it. And there's also so much information coming in about everything else that's happening around the world. And then Venezuela and now Iran. It's hard for those of us that are advocating for accountability or for a thoughtful military support for Ukraine to keep the attention of the public that's necessary in a democracy. Too much of a good thing.
Yeah, too much of a good thing, but also open to political manipulation. Without wanting to trivialize all of the things that have been going on, you might describe the Trump year in terms of seasons. Season 1 was Venezuela, season 2 was Greenland, season 3 is Iran, season 4 is Cuba. We might get back down to, we might have season 5, which you go back to Greenland again. In some ways, you might say some of this, yes, there's a lot of, the political cycle is what it is until we've got the midterms in November, but even in that political cycle, you've got the question about managing attention in there and how social media might frame people's engagement with politics in between all of that. And that poses not only questions for, as I said, legitimacy, but possibly even probably even questions around strategy making. How do you relate ends, ways, and means in when you've got extremely fast targeting cycles at a tactical level through Project Maven and Pete Hegseth doing all of this stuff, and then you've got very fast cycles in social media. And if the politics on social media and the targeting in the military aren't linked, then you've got all the. It's not just that AI is creating these problems. How do we trace causality? But how do we relate ends and means? Ends and what? How do we get there? How do we reconnect those in terms of managing state military power and legitimating those forms of military power?
Let's pick up on AI a little bit and where it's headed, because now whenever we talk about AI, everyone says, well, the safeguard is the human in the loop, a human on the loop. But I've seen it even with myself when I'm working with my AI, which I've named Crazy Monkey. And I ask it for, okay, I'm thinking about taking my dog Scrappy for a walk in one of the nearby parks today. What do you recommend? I'm the human in the loop. AI recommends something like, okay. So my adult supervision, my human supervision of my thought partner is, okay, I'm fine. Let's do that. So what happens when AI becomes so powerful, so fluid in targeting, strategic decision-making? Hey, if we target this and there's this and this, is this going to be a war crime? AI says, no, I don't think so. Okay. And then you push the button. What is accountability, or how does that change how we've approached just war, complying with international law, doing what's right in a conflict when we outsource it to AI?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and there are definitely people who, but maybe better than me, who've answered this question already. But I think I can pick up on it from a military logic point of view more than I can from a legal framework. In my mind, there are a couple of things we've got to remember. These technologies are not evenly distributed around the world. So even though the US may be perfecting the art of applying these techs in Iran, and I said perfecting, it's not quite the Iran campaign as it is, but it's not necessarily in the case that other parts of the world have these technologies. And sometimes the technology seems to me to be so seductive that people say, of course we need to increase the speed and tempo and manage. If we don't, then from a military logic point of view, then we are going to put ourselves in a position where we'll lose. And quite a lot of me goes, actually, there are only really two powers that have managed to perfect this. And I say perfect, and I'm like perfect or experiment with it enough to make it look like it's coherent and working in a way that you might want to make use of it, is Israel and the US. Everywhere else, it's a state of experimentation or partial application. And that, with all due respect to Ukraine, because clearly the folks in Ukraine have been working very hard on this technology, but delivering 500 targets a day, attacking 500 targets a day using this technology, that's pretty sophisticated stuff. And of course, there are tight things about this between, and just to be clear, of course, there are tight things about this between what's been going on in Ukraine and Maven and what's been going on in Israel. Although I noted that the other day that, as an aside, before I get into your good question, as an aside, the Ukrainians decided to release the data that they'd captured in relation to fighting in Ukraine for the use of other defense industrial partners, which struck me as being a very sensible way of diversifying the market in relation to these technologies. But who's providing these technologies? But to come back to your question, I think that the technology becomes very seductive. And if speed becomes all encompassing rather than deliberation, and everything is optimized around speed over and above deliberation, then I think we clearly have a potential mix of things going on here that are challenging for lawyers who aren't inside the armed forces. And of course, those who are inside the armed forces are under more pressure to say yes and to have their code of practices and the law of armed conflict reframed around the need to service those targets over and above making sure that the attack on those targets is in some way compliant with the laws of armed conflict. So I think that's clearly the direction of travel. I do wonder, though, whether this is whether it will actually deliver on the strategic ambitions of those countries that are aiming to make use of the technology. It is not using these technologies at speed in order to annihilate quickly. Does that necessarily produce the strategic outcomes you want? And I think, again, Iran strikes me as being one of those moments where history and geography, and dare I say, even strategic theories, has trumped AI. And it seems to me, because I'm not convinced yet, although maybe over the next few weeks, President Trump will prove me wrong, but I'm not convinced yet that is some kind of strategic victory for the US at the moment. It may become one. I think even if you go quicker, does it actually produce the strategic outcomes that you want? And so I think deliberation and reflection and placing this in a broader political context is very important. But of course, as you do that, you create more opportunity and space for legal arguments to be put into the framework. And I think there's a reason when these legal arguments are not just nice to haves. It's not just that we're being progressive or woke or something. These legal frameworks are there for a good reason. They're good there. They're there for a good reason because they're about protecting us as much as that is in the national interest as much as it is anything else. So a little bit of me finds the arguments that the ends justifies the means. That argument, which is basically where the logic is going, is self-defeating and actually not just in legal terms, but strategic terms undermines the whole point of conflict in the first place.
And especially when the means are developing so rapidly and to a degree, somewhat unaccountable, depending on how you program your AI or, how it's been trained. Matthew, let me ask you one last question. And this is a key takeaway question for our thousands of listeners. They're going to be facing this for the coming decades. The digitization of warfare is going to accelerate. It's going to accelerate exponentially.
Yeah.
Share with us not what we should think, but how we should think about it. What frame of reference do we create so that we can process all of these exponential changes that we're going to be seeing in the digitization of warfare and make sense of it and apply it, whether we're lawyers or peace builders, mediators, or parties to conflict?
So I think that crucially, we've moved from an analog digital divide to working in a fourth dimension where these things are overlapping, they're integrated. I can't even imagine contemporary life without something digital happening in it. And If that's the case, then we absolutely must be attentive to the digital mediation of how digital things mediate war, mediate our understanding, mediate our engagement. And of course, that inevitably means we need to pay attention to the platforms and the technologies and the infrastructure and the connected infrastructures that make our contemporary lives possible. And of course, that you've been alluding to that over the last 30 minutes or so about that public-private relationship and how those things might be regulated, who's involved in their creation and construction, and how accountable some of those people might be. And getting inside the black box of the technology becomes even more important because it says in there what we might consider to be democratically accountable or legally justifiable or socially acceptable or even, dare I say it, morally acceptable. And this is not just me saying we should sacrifice military efficiency on the altar of democracy. Military efficiency has value. And I'm not personally, anyway, a pacifist. It is important to me that our armed forces and the technologies that they make use of are democratically accountable to those who we vote for. And that does imply then that it's a sort of civic responsibility, both for us as individuals, but also from the point of view of our politicians, that they actually improve their digital literacy considerably more than we are currently, so that we can not get caught in this situation where, because it looks Gucci and because that we've been lobbied to buy this stuff, we go ahead and buy it. This is not just a commercial set of challenges. This is about what civic responsibility means in the 21st century. So a little bit of me is somewhat frustrated with the idea that it's just acceptable to do whatever's convenient or makes sense from how is it affecting our lives in an immediately better sense, when actually, if I think about who the adversaries are that are making use of some of these technologies, we go back to AI, as I said, the US, Ukraine, Israel, these countries that are affecting these technologies, some are further along that line than others. But when are we going to have to use it? Why is it just because the other guys have got it? That means that we need to pursue things in the same way that they do. And so that logic of the bad guys are going to have it, so we need to have it too, strikes me as being, it needs to be balanced against what does society choose. It's not just a military choice, it's a social choice. And so that attention to digital media, the mediatization and mediation of the way these technologies mediate war, we need to be paying a lot more attention to that, because that's even before the technologies that make the smartphone possible are the technologies that make AI possible. So there's a direct overlap. And so we absolutely need to be paying attention to those. And my gateway to that is the smartphone, because I think we're at a kind of liminal moment before we've reached AI and general AI, whatever that might imply for us as societies. That liminal moment is where we are right now. AI hasn't quite come through. We're still, a lot of the world is still online connected or becoming more connected, and those smartphone penetration into those different societies is happening. We need to be paying attention to that. And there's a point around civic responsibility demands it, in my mind.
No, Matthew, my key takeaway from that is digital literacy is crucial for everyone, whether you're a social scientist, whether you're a lawyer. There can't be any sort of, I'm a lawyer, I don't need to know how these things work or what they can do, because it permeates all of our spheres of engagement. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today and for your insightful reflections on how technology, the weapon digitalization, of war, is transforming both the battlefield and the law, and how society understands and interacts with these conflicts. So grateful for having you on our program, Matthew.